Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 5, The Bells. Hello and welcome to Hoeglaw's Postmortem analysis for Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 5, which HBO has graciously titled before we actually taped this episode. And the name of the episode was The Bells. As with previous episodes of this Postmortem series, if you haven't seen the episode of Game of Thrones itself, this will be rife with spoilers. So please turn it off, come back later after you've seen the episode, and we're going to talk about everything that happened in it, what worked and what didn't work, and we'd be happy to have you then, but I don't want to spoil it for anybody. All right, everybody else, let's talk about what is surely going to be one of the biggest episodes of the season, and probably one of the biggest episodes of the series, at least in terms of body count and the actual damage that was done to the cast of Game of Thrones. I think overall, after we got through the last episode and all of its preparation for what would be the Battle of King's Landing, I think we all expected some of the things that happened in today's episode. And I want to say at the start, I don't think that's altogether a bad thing. I'd rather have good foreshadowing, good character development, good descriptions of how characters behave and the choices that they make to get to a point like we saw today, rather than have subversion just for the sake of subversion. Now, we can argue about whether or not what Dany did in this episode and what is clearly going to be the kind of end game state for her and for Jon is warranted by what the writing has done in previous seasons. I certainly am on the side of folks that say the showrunners didn't do a great job of establishing this Mad Queen plotline for Dany. And now that we're dealing with it, I think they're doing the best that they can. I actually like this episode significantly more than I thought I would, coming off of the end of last episode and kind of making some of the assertions as to what I thought would happen. If you followed my postmortem reactions to that episode, you know I thought at the end of it, they were establishing that they were going to go with the Mad Queen, and that this would all be the Battle of King's Landing, much like the Battle of Winterfell was one whole episode. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. They didn't just do one big, long 80-minute battle. There actually was quite a lot of discussion of politics and discussion of what it meant to sack King's Landing, how it should be done. Some other scenes we're going to talk about after we get through with our overall thoughts and we go through on a kind of scene-by-scene basis and talk about various character arcs. But outside of that, the battle was obviously easier to see than the Battle of Winterfell. It was wonderfully directed by Miguel Sapochnik, who I've enjoyed in really every episode that he's done for Game of Thrones, and he just finds wonderful ways to depict action and to find different ways to show what's happening. I think when we get right down to it, there wasn't a great strategy or tactics on display here. If you want to level the criticism at the show, that essentially this was the same kind of thing that happened in the last episode or all the time in Season 7, only this time Drogon is stronger. This time Drogon avoids all the crossbow shots. This time he blows up the Iron Fleet. He decimates the walls. He comes through the other side and blows up the Golden Company, because this was the time that our guys were supposed to win. And I think that would be a perfectly fair criticism to level at the show. Certainly from a tactics and strategy standpoint, it is a criticism that I've leveled at the show for a long time now. I've just kind of given it up. You didn't see for Battle of Winterfell an episode of mine that really went over all of the tactical miscues and stupidity and the strategies that were put into play there, because it was what I was expecting off of Season 7. And I don't like to be negative if I can avoid it. I'm not doing these episodes, these postmortems, because I hate Game of Thrones. I want to love Game of Thrones. Unfortunately, I think the quality level has dived a fairly good deal. As a matter of fact, I was thinking while I was watching this episode today that it really is interesting because they kept all of the major players that made me love the show, with one notable exception in George R.R. Martin, the author of the books. But all of the actors are the same. All of the composing is the same. All of the cinematography is of a similar type. The actual scene-to-scene writing is similar, but the overall plot structure doesn't make any sense. It has the weaknesses that we've talked about in previous postmortems. So it winds up feeling, if you've seen the movie Men in Black, an old Will Smith science fiction movie, it reminded me of one of the very first things that happens in that movie is some aliens come and they take over a body and they wear him as a skin suit. And every time I watch Game of Thrones in season 8, and to some extent in season 7, it just kind of gives me this feeling like you're watching something that should be so much better than it is. And you want to love it if you loved the prior seasons, if you loved the books. And I do want to love it. And there's a lot to like here. There's a lot of good cinematography. There's a lot of fun things to see and to just kind of avail of yourselves entirely while you're watching. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make a ton of sense. It certainly doesn't fit very well in terms of a jigsaw puzzle piece with the prior seasons. We're going to talk about some of the character arcs that don't really make any sense to me, at least. And I'd be happy to hear your comments in the comments to this video to tell me why I'm wrong and exactly why the arcs work better than I think they do. I'd love to have that conversation. Please convince me that this is working a little bit better than I think while I'm taping these. But it does feel like it's all the same, except it's not. And I think a lot of that goes back to plotting. I think scene to scene, there are some good scenes. There's certainly some good acting. Peter Dinklage as Tyrion continues to stand out in his acting ability. He gets one big scene to play here. And we're going to talk about why that is a little weird of a scene in terms of how it fits into the plot. But if you actually think about it, without that scene, he wouldn't have a really great scene to play in the episode. And there wouldn't be a finale for Jaime and Tyrion. There wouldn't be a final scene for those two brothers and all that they have been through. So it does wind up feeling a little bit like almost reshoots in a movie where you look at the total structure of your script and you say, oh, there needs to be this beat. If Jaime's going to die at the end of the episode, I did say spoilers, then Tyrion needs to have some words with Jaime. And if he's not in the battle, if he's not in the Red Keep, and if he's not otherwise interacting with Jaime, then that conversation doesn't happen. There's no good way to do it. So they pull some strings. They move the puppets around to make it so that Jaime and Tyrion can talk, even though the overall plot for that event, he's captured and then he's released and Dany doesn't know or care, doesn't make a ton of sense in that context. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. But I don't mind that as much if you give me a really good scene, if you give me some meat to chew on. And I really do think that Tyrion and Jaime scene was a good one. They had a lot of good emotion. They had a lot of good acting. So I can be a little forgiving of those things, even though as an analytical guy and as someone that likes to think about these things pretty thoroughly, it doesn't make a ton of sense in the structure of the episode. I still think it was probably a good idea if you couldn't figure out a way to have that interaction happen more organically. As I said, visually, a lot of cool stuff to see in this episode. Really well done from the director's standpoint. I thought the score was really knocked out of the park. I really enjoyed a lot of the music in this episode. I particularly liked the kind of electronic dance music thumping that was playing as the preparation for the siege or battle or sacking or massacre of King's Landing. I really thought that was cool. And I really liked the credits of the episode. If you stayed through them, you heard that they put essentially the Reigns of Castamere, which has become the Lannister theme song, with what I usually call the Sept Explosion song or the Chapel Explosion song that is from, I believe, the end of season 6 that became a kind of quasi-Cersei theme, and they layered them on top of each other for some kind of thematic resonance with what happened to Jaime and to Cersei in this episode. I always like to try to catch those things, and I think there was a lot of good music there. So if you watch it a second time or a third time, really pay attention to the music because I think it's a lot of fun to listen to. With that all said, it's kind of the overall early thoughts. Let's go through the scenes as we've done in prior postmortems for this on a kind of summary basis. We're not going to go through every moment. We're just going to go through kind of the overall plot structure and flow of the episode, and I'm going to talk about some of my comments to them because I think that's the best way to try to dissect something like an 85-minute long version of Game of Thrones, is to really think about each scene and try not to miss where things have happened and they're interesting things to discuss. So at the very start of the episode, we see someone making notes, the treason notes that talk about Jon's true lineage. And I think somebody in the room that I was watching it with suggested that it was Sansa for a moment, but it turns out it was Varys, who, after the discussion with Tyrion at the end of the last episode, has decided he's going to back Jon. Jon is his horse, and he's decided that Jon is better for the realm. And we'll find out in this episode how right he is. But it's interesting. Character of Varys is one of my favorites. I have liked him in the books. I have liked him in the show. He is the spider, the man behind the scenes, the shadow master, who is constantly trying to depose rulers that are tyrannical and that are hurting their subjects, and help rulers that he thinks will be more just. And at the beginning of Game of Thrones, you see him starting to try to help move Dany into position to potentially make the realm better. And he's decided at this late stage that Jon is actually the best heir to the Iron Throne, and he's going to back him. But it's interesting that in the conversation with Tyrion last week, and in his conversation with Jon Snow directly this week, he is so upfront and obvious about what he's doing. He essentially asks these folks to commit treason, to betray their queen Daenerys. And it's really no surprise, if you can't get people to bite on your treason conspiracy, then you're going to die. And that's exactly what happens. Tyrion winds up telling Dany about Varys. Dany is clearly crazy at this point. She's starting to show that she's got this madness within her. They've got her in new makeup. You hear lines of dialogue in the episode that suggest she's not eating and not meeting with people. She's cut herself off. And the impetus behind that behavior appears to be that she lost her other dragon and she lost Missandei, and she's just generally an unhappy person with the way the Westeros invasion has gone. One of the things that I really find problematic about the Mad Queen plotline here is, one, I don't think they set up this tendency, this Targaryen craziness well enough with Dany throughout the prior seasons. And I think if you know to some level that this is your end state, and I presume that George R.R. Martin shared with them that this was going to be the kind of final state for Dany, then you can build that up better. You can layer that into your storytelling, and I really feel like they didn't. And that's one of the reasons why it winds up feeling so hollow right now. I think after you accept what you got in the last episode, that they're going to do the Mad Queen plotline, that these people are moved here, that the pieces are over here, and this is what's going to happen on the overall chessboard, I think this episode was, give or take, as good as you could do with that setup. But I think where it really got harmed was in the prior seasons, not setting up Dany's personality well enough, not really hammering the Targaryen craziness well enough. They certainly hit Jon's lineage hard enough. If you go back through all the seasons of Game of Thrones, they have clues everywhere about Jon's lineage, but they don't really talk as much, or at least it didn't hit me as much watching Game of Thrones, about the Targaryen craziness. And you get the coin flip discussion again today that a Targaryen essentially has a 50-50 chance of being crazy. And I think that's from a prior episode. It's certainly from the book. But I don't think they hit it hard enough, and it comes out of nowhere. It comes out of left field, and I can certainly see fans of Daenerys being upset about her portrayal here, and especially about how we don't really get any greater insight after she makes the decision to murder everyone. But before we get all the way there, Dany's got new makeup. Dany looks crazy. She has Varys killed. She has Drogon burn him to death. And as I said, once Varys has decided to commit treason, this action makes sense to me. This is what you do to a treasonous person. And so it's just a little bit weird that Varys decided that now was the time to take this direct action. From a writing standpoint, I would have liked to have seen something a little bit more direct that established that Varys thought this was an endgame type state, that this was a special circumstance, and he had a chance to make change, and if he didn't take it, he would regret it. He would feel guilt. But he knew that even though it was a low chance of success, he had to make his play right now. And you get maybe a little bit, you get a little tiny detail like that in the conversation with Tyrion from last week, but not enough for my liking, and not enough to kind of square the circle of what usually has been Varys' modus operandi, which is operating in the shadows and using his spy network. You get a reminder that he uses the kids in King's Landing as spies in this episode. But that kind of direct activity results in his death. And once he has decided to make that direct activity, it makes sense. But I'm just not sure that the Varys we have been taught to understand and know would have made that choice. And if he is going to make that choice, I would have liked to have seen that explained just a little bit better. After Varys is killed, Jon has a scene with Dany in which Dany is once again acting a little bit crazy, and she starts talking about the fact that the Westerosi don't really love her, but that sometimes it's necessary to rule through fear. Jon says he loves her. Dany tries to kiss him, and I guess Jon wasn't into it enough. I gotta be honest, since Varys had just died, at least by implication of the scene order, moments before, I don't really blame him for not being terribly excited about the prospect of doing anything with Dany right then, but Dany takes it as confirmation that the Westeros people are never going to love her like she wants to be loved, so she's going to have to become the evil emperor from Star Wars, Emperor Palpatine. Otherwise, that her rule is not going to work. So she says, essentially, let it be fear then. And then we move on to the next scene with Tyrion trying to strategize with her about what this siege of King's Landing is going to look like. And he essentially tells her, look, all the civilians are in the Red Keep or they're in the surrounding area. If you go in with the nuclear weapon that is Drogon, you're going to kill a lot of innocent people. And she basically says, this is the Mad Queen talking at this point in time. She basically says, Cersei wants to use our mercy against us. She wants to use our mercy as a weakness. And then she says, but I have mercy towards the future generations to not be held by a tyrant. So that's an interesting line. And I like that they're trying to get into what makes her madness at this point in time, because obviously what she's doing, controlling through fear, controlling through dragon fire, is controlling. It is tyrannical. She is the tyrant that she's trying to prevent them from being in the grip of. But she really does try to justify it by saying she doesn't have mercy towards these people because Cersei has given her no option. She has mercy towards future people because that's the best that she can do right now. And that's kind of the notions of her madness. And you kind of see a similar type of thought process that we kind of saw in the stories of the Mad King and the burn them all tirade that led to him being killed by Jaime Lannister. That's all stories in the world of Game of Thrones. But you can kind of feel a similar type of thing. The showrunners, the writers want us to start equating the Mad Queen with the Mad King and wondering how it's all going to turn out. At the end of this discussion, Tyrion winds up saying essentially, hey, look, if you hear bells, that means the city surrendered. Please call off the attack, at least if you hear bells. And I said to my friends who I was watching the episode with, well, that was very subtle. Clearly, that's what's going to happen now because you need a way to communicate to the audience that she has crossed the Rubicon, that she's gone over the threshold of madness. So you establish this threshold. You say, hey, if the city rings the bells, that means they're done. They're surrendered. We can stop. And if you do it anyway, that means you're the Mad Queen. And so he says it. It's very on the nose, and they're going to mention the bells a number of times. This was before we knew the name of the episode, because HBO does hide the names of the episodes. I believe when we turned this on, it was called Episode 72. We now know it's Episode 5, The Bells. So this would have been even easier to pluck out had we known the title. But this is the first time we hear about the bells, and it's clear how they're going to be used narratively. And really, if you're following the narrative, if you know how these things kind of work and you hear Tyrion talk about the bells, you know at that moment in time they're going all in with the Mad Queen plotline. And it's just a matter of how it plays out. Again, that's not a surprise from where they ended the episode last week, so that's A-okay. But it does give away a little bit of the game when you hear them try to establish the bell concept so hard. While Tyrion and Dany are having this conversation, while he's trying to convince her to not burn civilians alive, Arya and the Hound arrive at camp, and unlike Jaime, who has been captured, who we also hear about in that scene between Tyrion and Dany, Arya and the Hound arrive and basically say, Arya's here to kill Cersei, so we get a mission statement about Arya, which is really the first kind of information we get about how Arya related to Jon revealing his lineage in the woods that day, because the next scene we get in the episode last week is her just deciding to go south with the Hound. Arya and the Hound are going up to kill Cersei, and now she has a mission statement for the episode, or so we think. But as I said, Dany tells Tyrion that Jaime has been captured by trying to cross lines, and we have a wonderful scene between Jaime and Tyrion in which Tyrion talks to Jaime. While he's captured, shows him a key, indicates that he's going to let Jaime out. Now, I have to say, this is the first instance where we really get confirmation that, in my opinion, Jaime Lannister's arc was destroyed as part of a seasons-long effort to do so. But whereas, in my opinion, Jaime's arc had been to become a stronger person, to grow as a human being, to learn through all the things that he had seen in the prior seasons, and to separate from Cersei's narcissism and egotism and arrogance, and to separate entirely from that, and probably at the end of the day, to go back and kill her. That's not what he has decided to go back to King's Landing for. And that's kind of revealed by subtext here and obviously confirmed later on in the episode. But he's here because he loves her and he doesn't want to see her die alone, or he thinks he can save her or something along those lines. He's here for her. And Tyrion basically confirms that. He says he understands why Jaime is here. Jaime kind of goes back to his old ways of being kind of an ass and suggests that he doesn't care about the peasants of King's Landing when Tyrion tries to advocate for Jaime convincing Cersei to go a different direction. And then finally Tyrion decides to say, hey, look, I'm going to put a dinghy below the Red Keep. Get in it, get Cersei, escape with her, hopefully with a surrender involved. Otherwise, the civilians are going to die and Cersei's going to escape anyway. But the details aren't really covered here because for the most part, it's an emotional catharsis of a scene. It's designed for Tyrion and Jaime to have one last moment where Tyrion essentially says, Jaime, I'm doing this because you never saw me as a monster. You were still my brother. And they hug, and it's very emotional. And it's really well done. And it's only really after you see the episode that you realize that this scene doesn't make a ton of sense in the position that it's in. They say Jaime's captured. It's off screen. Jaime's not shown being captured. He's just in a room later on. Tyrion has this conversation. He also has a brief conversation with Davos that says, hey, can you smuggle something for me? And it's implied he's either getting smuggled to meet with Jaime or he's having Jaime smuggled into King's Landing. And then Jaime's next scene is he arrives in King's Landing, just like would have been Jaime's first scene if we just saw him riding south at the end of the last episode. So this does wind up feeling to me like kind of something artificial put into the episode because someone said, hey, if Jaime's going to die at the end of this episode, we haven't had him say goodbye to his brother Tyrion, so let's make sure we have that scene involved. So much like in something like Star Wars The Last Jedi, where you have this scene where Rey is knocked out and then Kylo Ren comes to and they basically say, Rey took a ship. And it's a ship we never see, and then suddenly she's on the Millennium Falcon. It does wind up feeling like, oh, this was something corrected in post, or it was a reshoot, or it was something that was designed to fix a flaw that they saw in their own script. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It does happen that way sometimes, and maybe I'm completely wrong on that, but it was the feel that was given to this scene of that kind of artificiality. But it was a good scene. I think we can forgive showrunners as puppet masters for good scenes like this one. So now it's time to discuss the actual quote-unquote Battle of King's Landing, which wasn't much of a battle as it turned out, which I think is to their benefit, as we talked about in the Battle of Winterfell, as we would have talked about if I was doing postmortems during the Battle of the Bastards and things like that. Tactics and strategy aren't the showrunners' strengths. They're not good at them. They failed at them completely and utterly in Season 7, and so I think that to the extent they can avoid them, it is to their advantage. And they really did lean on the characters and the characterization in this episode. And I think it turned out all the better for it. But the reason they were able to do that is what actually is depicted in the Battle of King's Landing. So we start out with preparation. We've got that electronic dance music in the background. We've got a number of cool shots. This is really where the director is earning his pay on this kind of stuff. I loved how it looked. I think they did a fantastic job. It was very exciting to get prepared for what the battle was going to be. And then Euron, who I have long sought the death of, if only because he's a bad comic book style character, and not the good kind of comic books like the Avengers and what we see now in movies, but kind of maybe a Riddler from Batman Forever or something like that. Maybe the Arnold Schwarzenegger ice guy from Batman and Robin. Something comical and over the top. And so when Euron sees Drogon coming out of the sky to attack the Iron Fleet, I was hoping he would just be ended right there and then. He wasn't. And this goes to one of those criticisms that I described about the battle, which is that this is just the time when Drogon is stronger. Drogon appears to have taken his power puffs to start the day, and so his fire is much stronger. It's much more explosive. He doesn't get hit by any crossbow bolts. He destroys the entire Iron Fleet in basically one go, and then he destroys all of the crossbow things on the top of King's Landing's walls in a second go. And in the very next scene, we basically see the Golden Company also destroyed. They're standing out in front of the walls because, again, tactics and strategy. Why wouldn't you stand your infantry in front of your castle walls? Who am I to judge? But the Golden Company gets destroyed, and we see Cersei's window, and we see all the fire across King's Landing. It's a very cool shot. Cersei doesn't know what to do. She's just looking at everything. Very reminiscent of the way she looked out her window at the Sept exploding, only instead of it being a good thing for her, this is the end of her story. And I think to some extent she knows it. She certainly doesn't have an answer for Qyburn basically informing her of all the bad things that are happening in King's Landing. So she is watching. Everything is destroyed. Drogon is having all this success. There isn't really a different strategy. This is just the time that the good guys, quote unquote, win. And then we see Jon and Grey Worm and Tyrion. And we see Dany and Drogon land. And everybody waits to see if the bells will ring. We see the King's Landing, Kingsguard or army or whatever it is that's guarding the city at this point in time drop their swords. We hear people call for the bells to ring. We finally see the bells ring. And we see Dany and Drogon perched looking over the peasantry. And I thought to myself, actually, if you were just a peasant in Game of Thrones and you've heard all this bad stuff, you've lived a pretty crappy 5 years, and then you're just standing there and that thing lands in front of you, yeah, it's a bad day. That would be pretty freaky. They did a good job of establishing the scale and scope of Drogon and what these peasants are facing, and it does look intense. But it's here, when the bells are ringing, as Tyrion had established, as we could tell from the way the narrative was structured, as the bells are ringing, here is where the Mad Queen presents herself. The battle is won. Dany is going to be queen of the Seven Kingdoms. There's really no way for Cersei to get out of this. Everybody has thrown down their swords. And then Dany burns the city alive. And she doesn't start with the Red Keep. She doesn't go straight for Cersei or anything like that. She just starts burning people. Civilians, buildings, everything else. Almost like an arcade game where you're trying to fill in the entire square with your color. The entirety of King's Landing starts to be burned red. And then ultimately, in terms of the detail of the world, I really did like this piece. They start adding wildfire explosions, suggesting that the wildfire under the city or elsewhere in storehouses is starting to explode with the fire around the city. And that works really well from a visual standpoint, and it adds to the danger and destruction and feelings like this is the end of the world. At the same time, Grey Worm, still smarting from Missandei's death, decides to go on full tilt and, with Dany's essentially permission, starts killing the Kingsguard and the army that had decided to throw down their swords. And with him, and with that permission of Grey Worm throwing that spear, almost all of the army, the Dothraki, some of the Northmen, everybody else starts attacking everyone in King's Landing. And it's clear that this isn't going to be the Battle of King's Landing. This is going to be the massacre or the sacking of King's Landing. And Jon tries to stop them, as we would expect from what we know of Jon's character. But he is unable to do so because it's an army of angry people that had gotten up that morning ready to fight for their lives. And I do think this worked out okay. There was a question that we had in the room while we were watching the episode because the Northmen also join in on the raping and pillaging. And it seemed unclear exactly why that was happening if they believed in Jon as King of the North. But I do think, just from a kind of overall perspective, because they had gotten so fired up that morning, because you know that there's a good chance you're going to die. When you have that surrender, I think you're still kind of on edge. And once Dany gives them permission, and once Grey Worm gives them permission to go nuts on the folks in King's Landing, I don't doubt that would be what happens. And I think Jon knew that. I think Jon knew to try to stop them. I think at the end of the episode, you see Jon and Davos exchange a look that suggests that Davos knew that this was a possibility. But ultimately, it just spiraled downward from there. Once Dany goes full Mad Queen, once she starts burning the populace, all bets are off. You get a shot of Tyrion, really the last significant shot of Tyrion, where you get the impression that he knows he backed the wrong horse. He knows from the very start of the episode that he probably made a mistake in turning Varys in. And you get all of this guilt and weight from all of the main players now. And by that, I mean Jon and Tyrion specifically, about what Dany has become and what she's about to do to King's Landing. And to really punctuate this, they have Jon stop a rape and kill one of his own people in an alley to try to indicate exactly, one, how heroic he is, but just how off-kilter this battle has become because of what Dany has done. One thing I want to note from there is that you see Dany make the decision to burn everybody. You get some nice vocalless acting from Dany, but after she makes that decision, after Drogon starts burning everyone alive, you never see her again. You never see her say burn them all. You never see her emote or give any voice to the reasoning behind why this is happening right now. And so I think one of the reasons they wind up doing that is because they do want you to think of her as Emperor Palpatine, the evil emperor at this point, the faceless other that will need to be destroyed. And I think certainly with the way Jon reacts, the most poetic type of ending to this kind of plot line suggests that next week we will be seeing Jon killing Dany. That's the natural result of what this arc is. I don't think it's a good one. I don't think it's necessarily satisfying for the folks that have been fans of Jon or fans of Dany. And we're going to talk a little bit about which fans I think were most put off by this episode and probably by the whole series at the end of the day. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to whether or not you buy the showrunners' writing, whether you buy that they've delivered us to this point. Because I think if you do, once we're at this point, like I said, I think this episode did all right. I think it established what was happening well enough. I just think it made some interesting choices during the course of the episode, and one of those choices was not showing Dany anymore. I would have liked to have seen whether she was crying or cackling or rageful or something to give voice to what was happening, and they deny us that. I'm not willing to say that that's a mistake at this point in time, because I am curious as to how they finish off the series entirely, and I think they could establish what her mental state was for this battle better in the next episode. So we're going to put a pin in that. We're going to hold it for next week. But if they don't, I do think they missed a major chance to really add characterization to what was happening. And much like last week, where I complained about the fact that the showrunners cut away from Sansa and Arya's reaction to hearing that Jon is the heir to the Iron Throne, I think if they don't come back to really establish how Dany got to this point and why she made the choices that she made, then they're missing out. And certainly I think if it's just craziness, it's not a terribly interesting story. If you're just talking about a crazed killer, it's not as interesting as somebody that's motivated, as somebody that has intentions that you can understand even if they're crazy. Avengers Infinity War works as well as it does because Thanos is insane, but he has an insanity that you can understand, that he explains exactly how he came by his reasoning, and you can understand why one would think the way he does, even if his assumptions don't make any sense. So if they have that conversation, if Dany talks about why she did what she did, if Jon and Dany communicate on that level, at least for a few minutes next week, I'm perfectly willing to accept that they went away from her for 45 minutes of this episode. If they don't, I think it's just crazy for crazy's sake. And we already had a character like that, which brings us to the next scene, which is that Euron comes out of the ocean, having been missed by Drogon's dragonfire, to confront Jaime for essentially no reason. Euron starts this conversation with Jaime by saying that the battle's over, the city's lost. Obviously it is. The dragon is burning everything. This isn't a battle, it's a massacre. But then he decides that he's going to fight Jaime. He's just crazy, as it turns out. He wants to be seen as a king. And when Jaime finally kills him, which he does at the end of this battle, after getting stabbed in what looks to be both kidneys, at least both sides of himself, and it's clear that he's probably going to die as part of this climb up to the Red Keep as well. After that all happens, after Euron's been stabbed and is presumably going to die, he basically says, well, I got you. At least I can say I killed Jaime Lannister. And that seems to be his only motivation. His whole motivation through now 2 seasons of Game of Thrones is basically to just be a crazy evil guy. Even Ramsay Bolton had more characterization than this, and he was also a crazy evil guy. Euron is by far, in my opinion, the worst part of Season 7 and Season 8 of Game of Thrones, and not the least of which for the reason that he is the primary antagonist, the one that actually causes all this damage to Dany's fleet, to Dany's troops, to Dany's dragon. And he's just a comic book supervillain that comes out of nowhere, has all these superpowers, comes out of the ocean just to kill Jaime, and ultimately dies. And so Euron, yeah, if Euron had fans, then they are certainly going to be disappointed with his treatment in this episode. But if he did have fans, I'm very sorry for them. I can't understand why they would be fans. After the Euron scene, which is bad enough, we get a scene of Hound and Arya coming into the Red Keep, coming in to confront Cersei, and the Hound sends Arya home. And that's an interesting step. It works with their character arcs because the Hound has always seen Arya as both a little protege and somebody to kind of be protected. The Hound isn't really one to protect people so much, but he sends Arya home and basically says, hey, you don't want to be a soulless killer like I am. And she says, thank you. And I think that's an interesting beat. However, it does leave Arya kind of wanting for a plot line in this episode. And we're going to see ultimately where Arya winds up going as she gets sent home. The Siege of King's Landing continues with Drogon burning everything up. She runs around, she escapes. She runs around, she escapes. She almost dies a number of times, and then she leaves on a white horse that comes out of nowhere. And so Arya's plotline for this episode is head south after hearing that Jon is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, goes south to kill Queen Cersei, gets to where Queen Cersei is told to go home, says, okay, thanks, and winds up getting impacted by the entirety of the brunt of the Battle of King's Landing anyway. So she's mostly there, as best I can tell, from a narrative perspective to provide that kind of on-the-ground view of what this battle looks like for the peasantry, for the folks that aren't superheroes, aren't the Hound, aren't Jon, whomever. And that's useful enough, but I gotta believe that there was a way to present it where it wasn't Arya Stark, who isn't really a believable threat to die, and fails at mostly saving anybody that she tries to save while she is running around almost getting hit by buildings and things of that nature. But they wanted to have her in the episode, so they put her in this scene, the series of scenes, and then ultimately just had her escape and run away. While that happens, the Hound goes up to the Red Keep and is confronted by Qyburn, Cersei, and his brother, the Mountain, Gregor Clegane. And Cleganebowl, which is the name that book readers have been giving the confrontation between the Mountain and the Hound for a long, long time now, is on. They are going to fight. It's very clear. And as Qyburn and Cersei try to hold the Mountain back with commands, he ignores them. And this is really the first time, I think, that we have seen the Mountain ignore commands that have been given by Queen Cersei or Qyburn. In kind of the same way, Sandor winds up letting Cersei walk right by him when she leaves after the Mountain just outright kills Qyburn, slams his head against a wall, throws him against some rocks, and Qyburn is done. By far my favorite death of the episode, because Qyburn was a good character. He wasn't that important of a character, and I really do like those kinds of quick, ignominious deaths because they do make things seem more brutal and realistic insofar as any kind of fight between a giant of a man and a zombie mountain of a man can be realistic. I thought it was interesting that Sandor just lets Cersei walk by. They're trying to establish in that scene that the Hound, Sandor, is fully engrossed in trying to take out his brother, who, if you remember from prior seasons or if you read the books, had really tortured him, tormented him as a child, and that this was about kind of getting a comeuppance in that fight. But he lets Cersei go. Obviously, in terms of the story that they're telling in this episode, that's to give Cersei and Jaime the chance to have a couple scenes together, and we're going to get to those right at the end of this summary. But outside of that reasoning, I think it would have been easy enough for the Hound to just slice her head off as she walked by, and he didn't do so. He was focused on the Mountain. And that fight that they wind up having, I thought was tremendous. The Mountain really is a zombie. He doesn't appear to feel anything. The Hound winds up slicing and dicing him in various ways, including at the end of their fight by slicing him in the eye, stabbing him in the eye. And it's very brutal. There's a lot of smashing of walls. There's a lot of crunching of bones. And it doesn't appear that there's any way to hurt or kill Gregor because he's a zombie man brought back to life by dark arts of Qyburn. And so at the end of this fight, I'm going to call it both die. It's unclear whether Gregor winds up dying, but they plunge through a wall and fall however many stories from the tower in the Red Keep all the way down to the kind of fire of the burning of King's Landing below. And it certainly would appear, Sandor's definitely dead, it would kill him, but it would appear that it's intended that both died, that Cleganebowl ended with both dying, with the Hound getting the comeuppance that he wanted, and with the Mountain finally being able to rest in peace, one would imagine. I can't imagine it's very fun to be resurrected as a zombie mountain to be controlled by Cersei and Qyburn. But in terms of that arc, this is really where I started thinking, this Game of Thrones show that we've watched for all these many years, is an interesting thing, because you have Sandor, who we followed and who you've thought maybe was trying to grow as a person and to gain a conscience, or at least an understanding of morality. You remember that episode where he was at a kind of church commune and trying to learn about himself and be a better person. And it all ends with a fight and they die. And we're going to see it's Cersei and Jaime. It all ends with them dying as well. And Jaime essentially rolling back every little bit of any kind of growth that he's had throughout the course of the series. And I sat back and I thought, while I was watching Cleganebowl and this really cool fight, which I really liked, that Game of Thrones has turned out to be a fairly nihilistic endeavor. It's completely devoid of most forms of what we would recognize as heroism, and even outside of heroism, of character growth. Everything that was character growth or suggested character growth in earlier seasons has been rolled back. And that's kind of sad. I think it's one of the reasons subconsciously that a lot of people are reacting to season 8 in the way that they are, is that seeing all of this growth, seeing all of these arcs that would suggest a certain ending point essentially be rolled back to take people back to a state that they existed in season 1 or season 2, because the showrunners think that that's a poetic end for them, is interesting. I'm not sure it's wrong. It's just a different story than I had anticipated being told, and I don't like it as much as what I thought I was being told. I would have liked to have seen some growth, some different choices, and to some extent this applies to Arya as well. Arya has essentially grown opposite of what we would usually consider human growth. She's grown in skill set. She's an assassin now. She can kill anybody. She can wear people's faces. But the very first instance of potential growth that we've seen from Arya in some time is in this episode, where not only she calls the Hound Sandor, which may be the first time she said it in the series, but she also says essentially, thank you for not treating me as just an assassin, as a weapon to get Cersei, and for keeping me from becoming you. But absent that growth, up until now, Arya has really been closing herself off as a character. She was a different character at the start, and she's grown into something, but not something that we would usually classify as good. You don't necessarily want to be an assassin with a revenge list and be motivated by getting revenge on the people that have done you wrong. That's a good premise for a late-night thriller movie, but it's not so great a premise for a kind of humanitarian analysis of what makes a good human story. And so I think as I was reflecting on this, I've come to the opinion that I don't really like the story of Game of Thrones. And that might mean I don't really like the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series. I don't know, because George R.R. Martin may never finish it. But at least as presented where we're going in this series and what appears to be what's going to happen next week, we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I don't necessarily like any of this. I don't like that Sandor doesn't really have any growth curve other than to get revenge on his brother. Cersei and Jaime ultimately, after Cleganebowl, or in parts of it because it's separated over a number of scenes, wind up meeting. They have a kind of tearful reunion where it's clear that Jaime is happy to see his sister. He's here for her. There's a really nice little bit of scoring that plays as kind of slow-motion piano-based Rains of Castamere, which I enjoyed when they met. And then they ultimately are going to be taking the exit that Tyrion said that they should. They're going to the bottom of the Red Keep. We get a reappearance of that set with the big kind of dragon head, and they go to the tunnel that will get them out, where Tyrion has presumably left a dinghy, and it's all covered in rocks. And I jokingly said at the time, well, if you had Rey there, then she could move them for you, but they don't. So the keep is falling, and they wind up staying together. Cersei says she doesn't want to go like this, and Jaime winds up holding her head in his hands and saying, nothing else matters, only us, and rolls back entirely to some of the more toxic aspects of the relationship with Cersei, in a matter that I have to say, from a character standpoint, and there's nothing wrong with making somebody feel like this when you're watching a television show or a movie, but I have to say, for me personally, this was revolting. This was revulsive. This was not what I wanted to see from Jaime. I thought that he was getting on a curve to understand what nobility meant, to understand how toxic and evil Cersei was, and to see him roll that all back to go and be with her and say to her, nothing else matters, only us, is just the opposite of what I wanted from the Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister story. And I think they did Cersei a disservice this season, in all honesty. I said in my postmortem for episode 1 that I was unhappy with the Cersei and Euron scene. Most of that's from Euron because he is such a over-the-top, ridiculous character. But Cersei really didn't get much personalization, much characterization in this season. In season 8, she mostly stands at the window looking out at things. We don't even really get her ordering the hit on her brothers, which is never touched on again. It's clear that somebody somewhere decided that they wanted to have Bronn in the series, so they created this artificial plotline where he would show up in that one scene in the last episode and say, hey, give me a city, and they gave him a city, and that was it, because people like Bronn. But Cersei is supposed to have given that order to kill her brothers, and it never comes up again. It's not discussed with Tyrion at the end of the last episode. It's not discussed with Jaime here. Jaime certainly doesn't discuss it with her. So it's one of those areas of plot lines in the episode where it feels like, okay, there's this artificiality and there's this laziness in terms of tying all these things together. And so you wind up having scenes that feel a little bit more hollow than they should. And then you have scenes that are repulsive, like the scene where Jaime says nothing else matters, only us, after 8 seasons of learning how bad the relationship with Cersei is, and presumably growing enough to want to have as his partner for at least a short time, Brienne of Tarth, who is essentially what stands for nobility in Game of Thrones outside of Jon Snow, but really Brienne, who has come from nothing and has gained that noble status by her actions, her deeds, and her heart. And Jaime gives all that up to go die in the Red Keep with Cersei. And this was really the second point where I thought about the kind of inherent emptiness and nihilism of the character stories that we have been told in Game of Thrones. Finally, as I said, the episode ends with Arya escaping on a horse. And then we're all set up for the grand finale, episode 6, the final episode of Game of Thrones ever. And I think, frankly, it's well and truly time for the show to end. I think it was probably time to end if the showrunners were going to have this level of interest in the stories that they were telling maybe a season ago, maybe 2 seasons ago. But it's going to end next week. I think it's pretty clear what's going to happen to some extent, and we're going to talk about that. One thing I will say that I was really surprised by is I have long thought that the notion of who will sit the Iron Throne is a red herring. I've thought that nobody was going to sit the Iron Throne. You get a few hints at that in the show itself about Dany saying that she's going to break the wheel and things of that nature. I was surprised once the dragon started attacking everything. I thought that the final shot of the episode would be the Iron Throne melting, that someone might be ruler of the 7 kingdoms. They might be. It's hard to say. But there won't be an Iron Throne. It will have melted from Dragonfire, and that was good symbolism for really what had happened in the sacking of King's Landing. And one other thing that I thought of while I was watching the episode was how much better this would have felt to me personally, structurally, if you had the Battle of King's Landing, if you were dealing with Cersei and King's Landing and shoring up the south while the White Walkers were advancing on the north. In essence, reversing the order of events here. And if you got rid of Cersei and Euron in that Battle of Winterfell slot, obviously the first 2 episodes change. Everything really changes and flips on its head. But you say, at the end of last season, you bring the White down to Cersei. You don't have the teleportation up to the north. You just have everybody stuck in the south. You have to deal with the fact that Cersei won't join you. You have to take King's Landing. The White Walkers advance through Winterfell. Maybe they advance through other places that we have recognized. You wind up going and fighting them at Harrenhal or something along those lines. And I think that structure would work better. Even if you want to show Dany as the Mad Queen in the Battle of King's Landing, I think it presents an interesting element where you are dealing with death and the ultimate destruction of humanity with somebody that you think might be insane. And you have to use her because the dragons are so useful against the White Walkers and the zombie threat. I think that would have worked better. I'm not sure exactly how much detail they got from George R.R. Martin, how much they wanted to follow exactly the plotline and the order of events that occurred. But in thinking about how this all played out, I think structurally the biggest problem for me in the series, if you can't tell from listening to these postmortems, watching these on YouTube, is the fact that the White Walker threat, once eliminated, eliminates most of the mysticism, most of the saga that is Game of Thrones, and it all winds up being this very small political story about as it turns out, a crazy Targaryen, which even in George R. R. Martin's own history of Westeros is the primary story throughout the entirety of its history, a crazy Targaryen and how the folks deal with it. So in that context, without the White Walkers who are eliminated in one episode, you just have a story that's been told even in the world of Game of Thrones itself. And so I think that's the biggest problem I have still structurally. And I think if you reverse these things, it could have potentially worked better. But we'll never know because that didn't happen. I think now that we've got all the pieces where they're going to be, we can take a look at a few end states. So we've got Dany. She's clearly the Mad Queen. She's clearly the evil emperor. Somebody's going to have to take her out. Grey Worm, he's on tilt. He's with Dany, as best I can tell. Jon is resigned to Dany's craziness. Tyrion is resigned to Dany's craziness. Jaime's dead. Cersei's dead. Arya's escaped, probably resigned to Dany's craziness, I would imagine, seeing what she saw. Varys is dead. Davos is resigned to Dany's craziness. Euron dead. Qyburn dead. Sandor dead. Gregor dead, ? And so the pieces on the chessboard have really been wiped clean for the most part. The folks that aren't on here are Sansa and Brienne and the folks that stayed up north. Presumably they will be a part of the series finale, but everybody should be basically aligned against Dany, understanding that she's crazy and that she is the Mad Queen. And so I do think when we're anticipating what's going to happen next week, one of the things that's going to happen is, at this point in time, with the structure that what we've got going into episode 6, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, is going to have to kill Daenerys Stormborn. And that's going to be heartbreaking for a lot of people, I think. I think they didn't build that up properly over 8 seasons for either Jon or for Dany. And I think unless they present it really well and in a way I can't really imagine going into episode 6, that's going to wind up being the legacy of Game of Thrones. If you follow television at all, you know it has a long history of disappointing series finales that, especially in the age of serialization that we currently find ourselves in, have negatively impacted people's desires to view the series again. From the comedy standpoint, one of these that jumps out to me is if you watched How I Met Your Mother, it's the story of how a character Ted winds up meeting his mother, and it goes through as if the mother had already been met in 2030 and tells the entire story about how that mother was met. Now, this isn't a spoiler cast postmortem for How I Met Your Mother, so I'm not going to reveal everything that happens in the finale, except to say that what happened in that finale was so disappointing to people that a number of people swore off ever watching it again. And I think a lot of people felt the same way about some even more popular shows like Lost or science fiction shows like Battlestar Galactica that had these endings that, because it was a serialized story, you really wanted to believe while you were watching the story that it was leading to somewhere. And if the ending disappoints in this modern era of serialization, it winds up reflecting negatively on the entire endeavor. You wind up feeling bad about having invested your time and your interest and your energy in following the thing. And so one thing I'd like to see happen in the future, now that we are doing a lot more serialized television, is to have a real plan. Not a plan that is completely locked down, but at least a plan of what we think the end state of this story is and maybe what we think the themes of the whole story are, so that when we're writing that one episode in season 3 of a 9-season show and we're reflecting on where we have to get to and what the themes of the overall thrust of the story should be, we can at least try to make decisions based on the overall structure of what we're trying to put together, rather than seemingly have it come out of nowhere. I think the Mad Queen notion was maybe in the background. You heard some stories about the Targaryens, but it wasn't really obvious that this was the direction they were going to go until the last few scenes of episode 4 of the very last season of the show. And to me, I think that's unfair. It doesn't reward careful viewing. It doesn't reward people that put the investment into your show. And I think if Jon Snow really does wind up killing Daenerys next episode in the finale, it's going to ring false for a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to feel betrayed. And so that's what I fear will happen. I very much hope that if that is what happens in the next episode, that they present it in such a way that it is satisfying for everybody who has watched, that it is an ending that everybody can feel like they got what they paid for in terms of putting their time and energy and investment into the show. I fear that that may be impossible, but I very much hope to be wrong. after Jon kills Dany, assuming that he does, the question is, will he be eligible for the Iron Throne? I mean, at this point in time, you've got a situation where he backed the woman that killed all these civilians. So that's an error in judgment number one. And then in order to correct that action, he winds up killing Dany. Now, at that point, he might be considered the Queen Slayer. She's not the official queen, or maybe she is. And so he might have a similar kind of negative branding that Jaime Lannister had as the Kingslayer. But outside of that, it's essentially two major problems in judgment in a row in terms of helping her sack King's Landing and then betraying her and deciding that that wasn't a good thing after the fact rather than before. And so one does wonder whether or not they would want him on the throne. He's already expressed a desire to not rule the Seven Kingdoms, but I always liked Varys' argument that isn't that the best leader who doesn't want to lead. That being said, if Jon isn't eligible for the Iron Throne anymore, or the kingdoms, the Seven Kingdoms ruler, who would be? I think at this point in time, the really only obvious rulers are Starks. And obviously, of that group, Sansa is by far the most well-equipped, having dealt with politics, having learned from Peter Baelish, having dealt with the Vale and all the other things that go with it. But the question at that point becomes, as Varys said, and maybe they were setting this up, maybe they weren't, that the North in particular has some problems with female rulers. And especially when you have a Stark that is older than her, I believe he's older than her, and is going to be in line for the throne. Maybe Bran isn't older than her, which adds a different component to the decision-making. But obviously, one thing that definitely adds a component to the decision-making is that Bran doesn't want it because he's the crazy three-eyed raven. So the question becomes, does anybody want to be ruled by the kid in the wheelchair who talks to ravens and doesn't speak above a whisper and says really, really weird things? So if it's not Jon that's going to rule the Seven Kingdoms, it might be Sansa. It might be Bran. I don't see it being Arya. And so is that fulfilling? If you get to an ending of the show where Jon kills Dany and then Sansa takes over the Seven Kingdoms, or Bran, of all people, takes over the Seven Kingdoms, is that fulfilling? I do think it would be more ideal if the Iron Throne were melted and if everybody decided to essentially go their separate ways instead of being this super federation to have each of the Seven Kingdoms rule themselves. You could have scenes where Sansa's the head of Winterfell, where Gendry's the head of Storm's End, where all these various people have taken over as the heirs to the families in the various kingdoms. I don't know whether they will do that or not. I thought that was the direction they're going. I'm not so sure anymore. But either way, it will be interesting to watch. We'll certainly do a postmortem of that episode after it happens, just like this one, to talk about what happened in that episode. But who's to say? I think the only thing that I'm pretty sure of that will happen in the next episode is that Jon Snow will kill Daenerys Stormborn, and that will be a big deal for a lot of people, especially because I don't think it's been fully earned by the showrunners. Those are my thoughts on episode 5 of Game of Thrones Season 8, The Bells. If you like this video, please do like. Please subscribe to my channel. I talk about Game of Thrones. I talk about other pop culture items like Avengers Endgame and the movies that I've seen. I do that on the one side. I'm also a lawyer by day, so my primary episodes, my primary series is called Virtual Legality. In that series, I wind up talking about the business and law of a lot of companies, but in particular, information technology, software, video games, fun things like that. And I like to have those conversations, and those are put out on a fairly regular basis, at least once or twice a week. So please do check those out as well. Otherwise, if you thought this was interesting, if you thought somebody else would find it interesting, please share it around. I get a lot of engagement from new folks that like to add comments to my YouTube channel and either tell me I'm an idiot or sometimes tell me I'm right and that they like the content. But share it around if you find it interesting. If you watched it on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. And if you caught this on its podcast version, thank you so much for listening. And please do rate it on whatever podcast service you are listening to it on. Otherwise, I will catch you right here for the last postmortem analysis ever for Game of Thrones. Episode 6, whatever that winds up being called, next week. See you then.